The prospect of a conflict with China has loomed over the heads of Western security circles for decades. And so it should. After all, China is a nuclear-armed superpower with the world's second largest economy. Not too long ago, you could barely move for analysts saying it would soon surpass the United States. But they're not saying that anymore. Rather than storming ahead into a shiny utopia with Chinese characteristics, it has become increasingly evident that China is faltering. And while that may elicit some whoops of USA, USA, it probably shouldn't. You see, while China was closing the gap on the United States militarily and economically, it had a strong incentive to refrain from decisive acts of aggression as its chances of success were improving with time. The dragon could simply lay in wait. But with China facing a multitude of domestic and international challenges, that's no longer the case, pushing the world closer to the jaws of the Peking power trap. And when that trap finally snaps shut, everyone on Earth is going to feel it. Have you ever wondered how scammers, telemarketers, or even random strangers get your personal info? Well, that's because your data is being bought and sold by data brokers without you even knowing your address, your phone number, even who your relatives are. It's all out there. And that's where Incogni comes in. Incogni automatically contacts data brokers on your behalf and gets them to delete your information. No more spending hours trying to opt out manually. Incogni does all of that work for you. And if your data pops back up, well, they'll handle that too. They keep an eye on things for you. So look, what you need to do is take your personal data back with today's sponsor, Incogni. Use the code WARFRONTS at incogni.com/warfronts for 60% off an annual plan. That makes it less than $6 a month for real privacy protection. Don't wait, your data's already out there. Stop data brokers now at incogni.com/warfronts. And now back to today's episode. A weakening China is a dangerous China. And unless you've been living under a rock, chances are you've heard about at least some of the dangers. Starting with the Asian elephant in the room, China remains steadfast in its intention to annex Taiwan by any means necessary. In addition to putting the civil war to bed once and for all, annexing the island serves the strategic purpose of breaking the first island chain, a series of US-aligned islands currently acting as a maritime noose that could constrain China's naval access and trade security during wartime. In recent years, China has ramped up its provocations with a variety of simulated attacks. Most recently, in December 2024, China deployed around 90 warships and Coast Guard vessels to participate in military exercises around the island. Meanwhile, Beijing's assertiveness in the South China Sea points to another deteriorating situation that is unlikely to improve. China lays claim over vast swaths of the South China Sea through the controversial 9-line demarcation, which extends far beyond its internationally recognized maritime borders. Regional countries actively contest this. China, Taiwan, and Vietnam each claim sovereignty over the Paracel Islands in the northern region, which Beijing has controlled forcefully since seizing them from Hanoi in 1974. In the southern region, China, Taiwan, and Vietnam also lay claim to all of the Spratly Islands, while Brunei, Malaysia, and the Philippines claim some. China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines currently occupy several islands each. In 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines and in recent years has employed grey zone tactics, actions that achieve strategic goals without resorting to lethal force. Tactics such as ramming, shadowing, blocking, encircling, firing water cannons, and using military-grade lasers to harass ships. Tensions between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam have proven particularly volatile. Recognizing that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the latter pair overcame their differences by reaching an agreement in August 2024 to counter China through deepening maritime security collaboration. Adding further fuel to the watery inferno, satellite imagery has revealed Beijing's construction and militarization of artificial islands. According to the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, quoting here, China has engaged in unprecedented dredging and artificial island building in the Spratlys, creating 3,200 acres of new land, along with a substantial expansion of its presence in the Paracels. End quote. Now, the strategy of incrementally making territorial gains through small acts of aggression to achieve a larger objective is known as salami slicing. With nobody backing down, China is set to increasingly flex its muscles, leaving the South China Sea on a knife's edge. As the most prominent illustrations of China's aggression, these disconcerting examples underscore the threat of the Peking power trap, the most consequential theory 90% of humanity has just never heard of. At its most basic, the theory draws inspiration from the Thucydides trap, popularized by Harvard political scientist Graham Allison, who used it to contend that China, the rising power, and the US, the incumbent superpower, were destined for war due to their clashing ambitions and the inevitability of China overtaking. The Peking power trap builds on this by accounting for the increasingly accepted reality that China will not surpass the US. In their book, Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, authors Michael Beckley and Hal Brands write that, quote, rising powers become most aggressive when their fortunes fade, their difficulties multiply, and they realize they must achieve their ambitions now or miss the chance to do so forever. Therefore, as China is at a perilous moment, strong enough to violently challenge the existing order, yet losing confidence that time is on its side, the world is hurtling down a dangerous path. History is littered with examples of the Peking power trap. I mean, just look at the 20th century. Leading up to World War I, despite its strong economic and military position, Germany was suffering from domestic political tensions and feared encirclement from rival powers, Britain, France, and Russia. These concerns influenced more aggressive foreign policy, including a naval arms race and security alliances that ultimately contributed to the outbreak of the war. In the 1930s and 40s, Imperial Japan, threatened by economic and resource constraints, embarked on a destructive campaign of invasions to expand its territory, secure access to resources, and establish regional dominance. In 1956, the flagging powers of Britain and France, alongside Israel, launched an invasion in a desperate bid to maintain control over the strategically critical Suez Canal following Egypt's nationalization efforts. The move backfired, with international pressure forcing withdrawal. The episode is widely regarded as marking the end of both nations' roles as global superpowers. And those are just some examples. There are plenty more out there, but they all point in one worrying direction: a China that will act in increasingly alarming ways. The scale at which the country is attempting to redraw the lines is particularly concerning. Turning to the mainland, border hostility is never far from China's expansionist agenda. One example is the Himalayas, where tensions have been sky high over the past decade. Unfortunately, neighboring Bhutan, with its historic neutrality, limited military capabilities, and 477 kilometers of shared border with China, is essentially just a sitting duck. China has undertaken a series of incursions into the Bhutanese regions of Doklam, Jharkhand, and Pasamlung, all while also announcing fresh claims in the east towards Sakteng. This amounts to 12% of the country's territory. As Bhutan's greatest ally and security guarantor, India is concerned, particularly regarding Beijing's claims near the geographically narrow Siliguri corridor connecting mainland India to its northeastern states, known as the Seven Sisters. Although the clashes throughout the 20th century prove Sino-Indian border tensions are nothing new, when a series of skirmishes resurfaced in the 2010s, it disrupted a decades-long period of relative peace. Well, let you decide who's to blame. In 2013, a Chinese incursion into the Indian Ladakh region led to a 3-week standoff. In 2014, a Chinese incursion into the Indian territory of Chamar led to a 20-day standoff. In 2015, a Chinese incursion into the Indian Depsang Plains led to a 3-week confrontation. In 2017, India sent troops to prevent Chinese engineers from building a road near the Dokka La Pass in Bhutan, resulting in a 72-day standoff. In 2020, mutual discontent escalated into hand-to-hand fighting between Indian and Chinese troops, resulting in deaths on both sides. And in 2022, another Chinese incursion occurred, this time into Arunachal Pradesh Tawang district, resulting in more hand-to-hand combat. China's nightmare neighbor strategy also extends to its border with Nepal. In 2019, China encroached into multiple Nepalese districts. 1 year later, Chinese media even began to claim Mount Everest, known in Nepal as Sagarmatha, by using its Chinese name, Mount Kumalangma. However, due to Beijing's economic influence over Nepal, the Nepalese government has denied or downplayed these disputes out of fear of the potential consequences. China is also proven to be a thorn in the side of nations beyond its perceived sphere of influence. The multi-pronged hybrid warfare campaign currently being waged against the West illustrates this. One preferred method of executing this is through cyber attacks, with Chinese hacking group Salt Typhoon recently infiltrating US telecommunications providers, including Verizon and AT&T. Reports suggest they intercepted communications from prominent US government officials, potentially including the phones of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. In November 2024, Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, called the breach, quote, the worst telecom hack in our nation's history by far. Utilizing espionage to acquire sensitive information, absolutely nothing new for China. In April 2024, a UK parliamentary researcher and another man were charged under the Official Secrets Act for allegedly providing information, quote, useful to an enemy. There have been numerous similar cases across Europe and North America. Suspicions have also grown pertaining to China's involvement in targeting undersea infrastructure. In October 2023, a Hong Kong-flagged Chinese-registered vessel damaged 2 subsea data cables and a gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea. 1 year later, in November 2024, 2 fiber-optic cables were severed once again in the Baltic Sea as a Chinese ship sailed over them. In response, Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis posted on X, quoting here, "If I had a nickel for every time a Chinese ship was dragging its anchor on the bottom of the Baltic Sea in the vicinity of important cables, I would have 2 nickels." Which isn't much, but it's weird that it happened twice. The worrying part about all of this, with China's crises stacking up and fears mounting in Beijing, the peaking power trap could be priming to snap and make everything significantly worse. We'll start this section off with a quote. "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." Now, this phrase is often attributed to former French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Although historians dispute whether he uttered those words, the notion of China as a sleeping giant was spot on. As an economically backward agrarian society until the late 1970s, the rise of China over the past half-century is unprecedented. Fueled by a booming population, mass urbanization, a globalized economy, and an influx of foreign direct investment, China's export-led growth model fed the world's insatiable appetite for mass-produced low-cost items. China displaced Germany as the world's largest goods manufacturer in 2009, earning the title of the world's factory. 1 year later, it surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. With the country modernizing and the economy thriving, the dragon was finally spreading its wings. And, well, what could go wrong? Well, actually, quite a lot. A slowing economy, a demographic crisis, youth unemployment, a collapsing property market, civil disobedience, and a trade war with your number one customer. Life comes at you fast if you're a Chinese policymaker. Nowhere is that truer than when looking at the economy as a whole. China's economy today isn't merely off course, it's already struck the iceberg and begun to sink beneath the waves. Despite achieving an impressive average annual economic growth rate of 9% since 1989, China's economy is slowing down. The expectation was that the economy would rebound after the COVID-19 pandemic, and while GDP figures in 2020 and 2021 sparked hopes of a strong recovery, momentum soon lost steam. As mentioned, China's meteoric rise was fueled by its booming population. Well, the population ain't booming anymore, it's aging. And let me tell you, nothing gets easier as you get older. Unbeknownst to officials at the time, China's 1979 to 2015 one-child policy, which is believed to have prevented the births of 400 million babies, set in motion a demographic time bomb. In 2022, China's population declined for the first time in 60 years and has continued to fall since. Over the next decade, 300 million people aged 50 to 60 will leave the workforce. That's almost the same size as the entire population of the United States. With a greater strain on pension budgets and a shrinking workforce to drive the economy, the Lowy Institute projects growth to slow to 3% by 2030 and 2% by 2040. Such forecasts will be highly alarming for Beijing. As with many authoritarian states, the thought of a popular uprising gives CCP leaders sleepless nights. This is because in China, an unspoken agreement exists between the party and the population whereby the government represses freedoms, but in return, it improves living standards. However, if the CCP fails to hold up its end of the bargain, things become much less tolerable for the masses. And this is a key motivating factor behind the CCP's maintenance of such a tight grip on power, with state control of the media, censorship of foreign websites through the Great Firewall, and mass surveillance through the social credit system. Despite these strategies, tensions have boiled over before. Take the youth as an example. China is not an easy place for young people. The country's work culture routinely demands young workers to participate in a rat race 996 work culture. That's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week for low pay. And that's if they can get hired in the first place. Youth unemployment has persisted for years and is projected to remain problematic. In summer 2023, the youth unemployment rate hit a record 21%, forcing officials to suspend data publication. Sick and tired of reality falling woefully short of what was promised, China's youth have mobilized, expressing their disillusionment through social movements such as Tang Ping, meaning lie flat, and Bai Lan, which translates to let it rot. These movements reject the pursuit of success through hard work, instead favoring inactivity at the expense of the CCP. And this is far from ideal if you're Chinese President Xi Jinping, who highlighted in a 2022 speech that, quote, young people are the future of a nation. So, what does that future look like when you've turned the young people against you? Making matters worse, China's property market, which played a key role in the country's growth miracle and accounts for an astonishing 70% of household wealth, has undergone a severe downturn. To provide a quick rundown, the deregulation of property sales in 1997 opens the floodgates for major private real estate firms to enter the market alongside millions of domestic investors and begin speculating on property. With population growth and mass urbanization fueling housing demand and steady price increases, huge profits were made, prompting developers to sell properties before constructing them. Does that sound like a good business plan to you? Well, in 2020, President Xi Jinping bit the bullet and implemented stricter regulations on the real estate market, declaring, quote, "Houses are for living in, not for speculation." And well, that was a problem, because with developers selling unbuilt houses to fund those under construction, the house of cards was built on speculation. In the ensuing collapse, the government's measures caused buyer hesitation and a decline in housing demands, which in turn triggered price drops, thereby resulting in liquidity issues for developers who left housing projects unfinished. The CCP's refusal to bail property developers out sealed the fate of real estate giant Evergrande and placed others such as Country Garden and Vanke under pressure. The slump in the property sector continues to hinder the economy. With the domestic situation far from peachy, China could ill afford additional economic instability. A trade war was the last thing they needed. And yet, that's what they got. After accusing China of unfair trade practices, the 2017 to 2021 Trump administration imposed 4 rounds of tariffs on Chinese goods between July 2018 and May 2019. The scope quickly expanded to include policies aimed at decoupling the two economies. The Department of Commerce enforced strict licensing requirements for U.S. technology on over 600 Chinese companies. Congress passed the Export Controls Reform Act to restrict the exportation of dual-use technology to China. In a rare instance of continuity between the administrations, Trump's trade war expanded and intensified under President Biden, who targeted Chinese technology companies and their access to advanced semiconductor technology. Like a messy divorce after a decades-long marriage, there are no real winners from the trade war. For the U.S., downsides include higher consumer costs, investor uncertainty, and retaliatory Chinese tariffs. In China's case, reduced export demands and higher production costs have slowed the economy, and political uncertainty has devalued the yuan against the dollar. Analysts expect the yuan to break a 17-year low against the dollar in 2025, making Xi Jinping's dream of a powerful currency capable of playing a rising role in global trade more of a pipe dream. As you may have noticed, a paradox exists in that despite facing a litany of challenges, China is pressing forward with its foreign policy ambitions. In keeping with the Peking power trap, Dan Blumenthal's 2020 book, The China Nightmare: The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, argues that China is doubling down on its grand strategic ambitions because it is weakening. In other words, Beijing is going down swinging. While military investment has been climbing since the 1980s, Xi Jinping's ascent to power in 2010 marked a new era of ambition. During the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2017, Xi set out his goal for China to develop a, quote, world-class military by 2049 to mark the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. 1 year later, the US Department of Defense published its 2018 annual report to Congress and emphasized that, quote, Chinese military strategy documents highlight the requirement for a People's Liberation Army able to secure Chinese national interests overseas, including a growing emphasis on the importance of the maritime and information domains, offensive air operations, long-distance mobility operations, and space and cyber operations, end quote. China presently boasts the world's largest navy with over 370 vessels and continues to work on developing its historically brown water fleet focused on regional operations into a blue water navy capable of operating worldwide. Concerning air power, the 2024 edition of the US Department of Defense's report concluded that, quoting again, the People's Liberation Army Air Force and People's Liberation Army Navy together constitute the largest aviation force in the Indo-Pacific region and the third largest in the world, with over 3,150 total aircraft, of which approximately 2,400 are combat aircraft, including fighters, strategic bombers, tactical bombers, multi-mission tactical, and attack aircraft, end quote. Combined with advancements in technological integration that have modernized its aircraft and unmanned aerial systems, China's sights are set firmly on an air force capable of long-range air power projection. If that wasn't enough, China is also diversifying its nuclear forces through investment in land, sea, and air-based nuclear delivery platforms, with the same report stressing that, quote, the PLA seeks a larger and more diverse nuclear force comprised of systems ranging from low-yield precision strike missiles to ICBMs with multi-megaton yields to provide it options at every rung of the escalation ladder. So China's packing some serious firepower, But well, what about soft power? Now, by far the most prominent example, Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, was designed to project China's influence and secure access to key resources through large infrastructure projects. Drawing inspiration from the ancient Silk Road, the BRI initially aimed to create two major corridors: the Overland Silk Road economic belt, linking China to Europe through Central Asia and the Middle East, and the Maritime Silk Road, connecting China to Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. The BRI has significantly broadened since its inception, spreading China's economic and political influence across the globe. Despite sparking criticism from Western nations for facilitating debt-trap diplomacy, with countries subsequently facing economic crises after repayment requests, over 150 nations have signed an agreement under the framework. The BRI is undergoing a reconfiguration, with Xi Jinping highlighting in 2023 a shift from giant projects to fine brushstrokes. While 2024 statistics have yet to be published, China's investment in the project increased from $74.5 billion in 2022 to $92 billion in 2023. Although both figures are lower than in previous years, when $740 billion was invested between 2016 and 2020, sustained investment ensures the BRI snowball keeps on growing. So, China is amassing firepower and spreading its influence even as it succumbs to an onslaught of domestic crises. Simultaneously, Xi Jinping is running out of time to cement his legacy, and China's aspirations of becoming the dominant global power are slipping out of reach. But what does it all mean? And what lessons can we draw from the Peking power trap as we look ahead? Geopolitical strategists often mistakenly assume that decision makers will choose the logical course of action while failing to understand their perspective. A prime example of this came in an article published by Al Jazeera titled, "No, Russia will not invade Ukraine." It cited the Kremlin's interventions in Georgia, Syria, and Libya as evidence that Russia preferred cost-effective foreign policy and using limited operations to achieve objectives. Moscow wouldn't change strategy now. The military buildup must be a bargaining chip for European security negotiations. And yet, 15 days later, Russia invaded. Make no mistake, China isn't Russia, but that doesn't mean there are not lessons to be learned. Given the extent of China's aggression, it's easy to assume a great power conflict is inevitable. But the same was said about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and we know how that turned out. The truth is, avoiding the Peking power trap and the violence it would unleash comes down to deterrence. Take Taiwan as an example. The island lives under the perennial shadow of a Chinese invasion. However, the United States' deterrence policy has thus far kept a lid on things. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act laid out key provisions, including the US's commitment to, quote, make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability and, quoting again, maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan, end quote. But these deterrents are not as formidable as they once were. The US's strategy of denial, which aims to deter aggression by showing its forces could defeat a Chinese attack, is being undermined by China's military buildup and increasing ability to blockade Taiwan. Similarly, the strategy of punishment, which aims to deter an invasion by making the costs too significant, is being countered by Chinese efforts to stockpile energy, food, and critical supplies while building financial safeguards and localizing critical supply chains. Despite continued military investment, with growing domestic challenges, the odds will not become more favorable for Beijing. The real question is, how long will the population tolerate a costly conflict when troubles stack up at home? According to CIA Director William Burns, Xi has asked the People's Liberation Army for the capability to take Taiwan by 2027. If correct, it signals that Xi believes the window of opportunity is closing. In January 2024, when Lai Ching-te, also known as William Lai, won Taiwan's presidency for the Democratic Progressive Party, it marked the first time that a party secured a third consecutive presidential term. With the DPP taking a firmer stance against China compared with its main competitor, the Kuomintang, Beijing is likely losing patience with the prospect of achieving a peaceful unification akin to Macau's. The US and its allies must close China's window of opportunity as far as possible in every instance of aggression. But even then, it might not be enough. It's important to recognize that in an increasingly multipolar world, the China question involves many countries. Expect tensions to heighten across the board and new actors to weigh in. Vietnam and the Philippines have already bolstered their military presence in the South China Sea. India is strengthening its presence in the Indian Ocean and along the border with China. Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and Indonesia have all implemented similar measures. Regional partnerships, such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, joining the US, India, Japan, and Australia, as well as the AUKUS Security Pact between the US, UK, and Australia, demonstrate growing anti-China cooperation. How effective these are will be determined in the coming years. In November 2024, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru even advocated for an Asian NATO-style collective security organization to deter China. Multilateral efforts to contain China will act as a counterbalance to the increasing alignment between China, Russia, and North Korea, and even Iran. The risks have never been more pronounced, and the Peking power trap is nearly upon us. Thank you for watching.